the Virginia Funders Network. I know most all of you have been on some of our other sessions, so welcome back to today's session on impact investing. I'd like to just acknowledge Debbie Kasemeyer and Chris Crothers for putting this session together. And then we have two other folks who are engaged with us in the impact investing learning, and Deb Markley is on the call today, and then also Stephanie Randolph, who could not join us today. So our membership has grown to 110 grant-making organizations from every region of the Commonwealth. And as you've likely experienced, many of our learning sessions have focused on hearing from subject matter experts and then kind of having a Q&A. But today we're going to do something a little different, and this is going to be more of a conversation between Debbie and Chris in terms of how to bring your board on board. We heard at the conference that was an area that a lot of people were struggling with and really wanted some insight. So we hope to, just answer every question you have. There'll be time for Q&A and also for some sharing about your own experiences if you've already gone down this path. So without taking any more of their time, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie and Chris to get us started.
Patty, did you have something you were going to share first?
At the very end. I'm going to do it at the very end.
Oh, the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Debbie, okay. I'm going to share my screen real quickly and we'll get started. Let's see here. All right, y'all have it?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, let me jump a few slides. That's us. Debbie, I'll kick this slide off and then we'll, I'm going to turn it over to you. So really, thanks for the intro, Patty. When we were trying to put this session together, we were trying to think about different kinds of organizations, what some of the needs that they may have. So this is not an exhaustive list. I know Patty said we're going to give you a checklist and answer all your questions, but we probably won't. We'll be really just scratching the surface, but really wanted to start a conversation. Would love to be able to get some guidance from y'all who are on the call to ask questions and have a conversation here. But really what we're going to do, I'll lay out the agenda real fast. So we're going to level set. I think this is always something that's important. So we're going to try and land on the definition of impact investing, or at least identify a definition for our conversation. And then we're really going to talk about the processes that you could consider when you're having conversation with your board to try and get on this journey. So we'll touch on what you need to do as an executive or a board advocate to be able to get your own house in order, get your ducks in a row, whatever metaphor you want to use, to be able to get the conversation started. And then we're going to move into the actual process of having conversation with the board, engaging the board, providing support and education. And then lastly, if you're lucky enough to get this far and the board's interested in moving forward, then how do you begin to start drafting initial designs for programs and then bringing those to the board for approval. So that's what we're going to outline today. Love to get, love to get your questions throughout. If you want to share your experiences, I think we're going to have time to do that, and would love to hear what you've gone through. We'll have time at the end to do that, and that'll give you a little more runway to have a conversation. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Debbie to talk about level setting.
Thanks, Chris. And I saw that Angie had shared bios, so we're not going to introduce ourselves here, but if anyone has any questions in terms of the seats that we sit in, because obviously that impacts how you view this, I'm happy to answer those too. So the first thing in anytime we're talking about this is always defining impact investing. So since there is no actual defined term, it can be used a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. And so we always want to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So for our conversation, we are talking about the deployment of capital with intentional identified impacts. So we always say it's but for our investment, the impacts would not have occurred. So that's going to be what we're using today. We're not talking about ESG type investing. We're talking about direct investing into communities with an intentional impact as a result. Yeah, so we're not talking about ESG screens, tilts, all that sort of stuff. And then this is what we had gone through in the last session, the session we did when we were in person. I'm not going to go through all these individually. I'm just going to hit on a couple that are probably most relevant here. So PRI, or program-related investment, it's an IRS-defined term. And I think that's important in terms of when you're talking to your board and what your strategy is going to be, making sure that you understand PRI, program-related investments, that tool, how that tool applies to you, mission-related investments, the same. Sort of the definition of that tool, how it applies to your organization. I think we're going to get into that a little bit in the next. And then CDFIs are community development financial institutions, which are nonprofit loan funds that have a designation from the CDFI fund to serve low and moderate income people. That's where a lot of foundations start their investment journey, is with CDFIs. And then guarantees is another tool that we see a lot of foundations using in this space. So again, just having a good working definition for yourself so that you can share that with your board. What's next, Chris? Yeah, I'm not going to go through all these. I think we can skip all that. So I'll go back to you, Chris.
Great, and we'll provide this deck afterwards. I believe Patty will distribute it, and it's Debbie's got some great information on the taxonomy and everything. So you'll have that, and here's some links on this slide as well. And I'm going to say in advance, I apologize. I'm calling in from Florida, and we are the land of the big loud trucks, and I just had a series of like big old trucks drive by the house, and they were super loud. So if you hear a weird noise, that's our truck contingent here. So moving on, let's see. So we're going to talk about getting your house in order, okay? And this is really around, from the perspective of the foundation executive, the staff person, the board advocate, whomever is really starting to lead the charge around impact investing in your organization. And just a few things that you might want to consider as you kind of start this journey. Really, there's three areas that you might want to focus on. So the first one we recommend is really just do your research, right? For us at the Jessie duPont Fund, it really started with, are we even, can we even do it? Are we even allowed to do it underneath the edicts of the will and the trust? So we had to do kind of a deep dive internally just to know that we had the ability to move into this space. So that could be looking through your bylaws, looking through a will if you have one, understanding the trust, whatever you need to do there. If you don't have those constraints, and even if you do have a will, it's always good to have the conversation early on with your counsel and with your investment advisor. Your counsel, you may have done a quick scan of any of your governing documents, but your counsel will probably have the last say in it. And then again, the investment advisor conversation is an important one because they're your partner in this journey. They're the ones that are looking out for your endowment, making recommendations. So making sure that you bring them into the loop early on and let them know what your intentions and goals are is super important so that you can get clarity on the front end and get support wherever you need in building out the program. And then you really just get into a staff deep dive. We say getting into the weeds. So that is digging into all the literature that's out there, again, referring to the taxonomy and understanding the IRS rules and the like. So becoming staff or impact investing advocate experts, you'll be the local expert that's going to be driving the conversation. And then the other part of the research is trying to understand what could be out there. So getting your feet wet around scanning opportunities. For us, we were moving into the community development financial institution space early on. That was how a lot of foundations, I think, get into impact investing. We were no different. So doing a scan of CDFIs, understanding which ones are serving your area, understanding what their lines of business are. Are they focused on affordable housing? Are they focused on small business development, technical assistance, understanding what those business lines are so that you can understand how they align with your mission. And then again, looking for potential direct investments. Is there a local investor group handy? Is there an affinity group that you could tap into, and down the line? Debbie, do you have any comments on the research?
Yeah, and I honestly don't know what's in the next slides, but so if I'm jumping ahead, I apologize. But the one thing I would say is that when you're doing this research, what you're really trying to do is trying to figure out what questions your board may have, and being able to address those questions. So trying to prepare as much as possible to address those potential questions with facts. And that will help you, because what you're trying to do is build this base of trust with your board. So it's really important, depending upon where you sit in the organization, that you're doing this with others. So whether that's like Chris said, obviously any outside counsel you have, if you have a CFO, anyone that's on the investment side of the house, you want to make sure that they're involved in this research and conversation as well. Or whether or not you have someone that's directly tagged with this impact investing. And then I would even say the grant people that are doing the grant program, and sometimes those are the same people, right? But just making sure that everyone in the foundation that knows you're working on this, and that they're all sort of involved in that whole process with an eye towards how can we make this understandable to the board. And if you have any committees or like a finance committee or anything like that, how do you make it understandable to them as well? I think the other thing on this is, like, when you say, can you do it, like really getting granular there. So what type of foundation are you? Are you public? Are you private? What are the restrictions? Like Chris has a will. So there's a will involved, which, isn't involved in some of these others. And the one thing I'd say is it's really complex. So you most likely are going to have to get legal counsel involved, always earlier to do it sooner rather than later, because you really are trying to almost make a case. So you're basically trying to build out the research, figure out what you can and can't do, and then from there, continue one step at a time to build your case so that when you get in front of your board, you can lay out a very cohesive, well-researched argument as to why your foundation can do this type of activity, and then why they would want to do this type of activity. And then I guess the third would be when we're talking about scanning opportunities, like, and what's the risk? And I think we're going to talk about that later. But that's sort of, building that case. The more that you can do that in the front, I think it's better, just because what you're trying to do here is build up the confidence level of your board in your ability and the staff's ability to do this kind of work, because a lot of times they might think, oh, that's investing, you shouldn't be doing that. So getting in front of that, I think, is really helpful on the top of the house.
Absolutely. And then underneath the research, of course, we just listed a few resources. There are many, many more that are out there. But when you get this presentation, these will have links. It'll take you to the website. So Mission Investors Exchange is one of the premier organizations, membership organizations that you can join. Council on Foundations has done some work in the past around impact investing. They provide some sort of some guidelines, especially if you're a member. They'll have some legal support for you as a foundation. Locus, of course, when we're starting to move now into Virginia-specific organizations, Locus is available. Don't forget Virginia Funders Network, where they're doing a big push around impact investing, which we're glad to be a part of. And then Virginia Impact Investing Forum. And then here's what I'd recommend just highly. Don't forget to reach out to peers and, ask a lot of questions. I think that is probably some of the most valuable information that you're going to find by being connected to folks that are already working in the space, that have kind of gone through similar circumstances, being able to, share what's worked well for them, what didn't work well. If I could do it all over again, I would have done this. And again, sticking pins in things. So, don't forget this. This is super important. Having those conversations is vital. And plus, I think this this sector, I mean, I think we're pretty collegial. I mean, I would go on a limb to say that folks really want to share information and kind of build the field. So don't hesitate reaching out to folks. And of course, there are just countless webinars and YouTube videos out there that could support that work as well.
Yeah, and I would also say you wouldn't necessarily, when on the peer support side, you don't have to limit yourself to just the foundations that or peers that are in Virginia. You should feel comfortable reaching across state lines to an organization like yours. So if you're a community foundation and you read or hear about a community foundation in another community that's doing something that you're interested in, you should reach out to them. Similarly, health foundations and others. I think the thing with Chris, so Mark Constantine, who I'm sure most of you know from his work here in Virginia, actually worked at Jessie duPont prior and was the person there at the time they started to undertake this impact investing. I met Mark in Chicago when he came and spent a week in Chicago doing visits with a variety of foundations and CDFIs, investigating and doing his research. So 20 years later, we're still doing this together. But I think that's a really good example, though, of how don't feel like you have to be stay in your state. That you should feel free to reach out to anyone in any state that may have information that's useful to you.
Good point. Good point. And then one of the last things you might want to consider here, and then we'll move on, is Debbie was talking about anticipating some of the questions, preparing for the conversation, building the case. So anticipating some of the barriers and setting the table for the conversation. So some things that you might consider here. I think one of the important things in this conversation before you really start getting into the meat of impact investing, sometimes it's helpful to engage the board in a values conversation simply because you have an opportunity to have the board sit around with one another and talk about how they would like to execute the changes that they'd like to see in the world, right? So we understand what our mission is, but how do we want to do it? And how do we want to be seen? And how do we want to conduct ourselves as we do it? So for instance, of course, we have a lot of health conversion foundations in Virginia. You can definitely have the conversation around the values of health and the social determinants of health they begin to leak into those values conversations. Well, that's when you could start to bring in some of the other impact related initiatives that might not line up with what you would expect a health conversion foundation to fund. So for instance, affordable housing, right, as a social determinant of health is a natural connector to health conversion foundations and other anchor institutions in the community, including higher ed. So by having some of these values conversations early, you could start to be able to pick from those conversations when you're building your case. And then as you come back with what your menu of options can be, you're able to come back to the values conversation and show how that aligns. You can also pique interest early on by starting to kind of share stories and press regularly around impact investing without necessarily having the conversation on the front end about it. Start to socialize the idea of what's possible and who's doing what and where. If there's an opportunity to identify a board champion, then start to spend some extra time with that person. Understand what their needs are. Maybe they're the expert and you're going to help support them. Maybe it's vice versa. But anyway, if you have that board champion, it's vital because at some point down the line, staff can carry the ball so far. It never hurts to have that voice of a board member behind you as you're starting to have these conversations. As you're doing your research, start to identify those learning materials that stand out to you. As Debbie said, you don't want to get too detailed. You don't want to get so detailed that you lose folks. So you're kind of looking for very informative information, great examples, but examples that are communicated in such a way as they're easy to understand and they're easy to identify the impact and then how that impact aligns with what you're trying to achieve. And lastly, this is a little bit of an outlier because we said we weren't going to get into the endowment side of it, and Debbie's smiling here. It never hurts also to do some research on the front end to understand what you own. This goes back to the values conversation. There are many examples of how this plays out. But for instance, if you're Health Conversion Foundation and you're investing all your grant dollars in the community around improving health outcomes, and then you go into your endowment and then you're invested thousands and thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in funds that are carrying Philip Morris, for instance, then you're kind of working opposite from your mission. So every grant dollar that you're putting out there, arguably someone could say, well, you're erasing that because you're invested here and there. So having this exercise of understanding what you own is great, because then it'll come back in the engagement piece of the values conversation.
Yeah, other thing I would say when identifying a board champion, I think is key, but it's also identifying who is the biggest critic. So I think those are the two things you need to focus on, because the board champion is great and you're going to need them, but you need to identify that critic and you need to get to know what their issue is and what their problem is in terms of this initiative, and really try to work to change that perception. And I will say in two of the foundations that I've worked with, we had that exact situation. I'm a banker, and I will say that both of them are former bankers, and they seem to be just not really believing that you can invest capital this way and actually have an impact and get it back. Like, they felt it was like one or the other. So, we identified that early on and really made a concerted effort to include them in conversations early to make sure that they fully understood what was going on, addressing any concerns that they had, giving them lots of information, probably oversharing in that regard. And then in their case, really focusing, I'm sorry, am I cracking? Mm-hmm. I'm gonna take off my headphones and see if that helps. Okay, let me finish and then I'll take them off, because I don't know how to do it without cutting out totally. But identifying what their issues may be. In our particular case, when I was talking about the bank people, we really focused on the underwriting and the credit side of things, which really did then help us as we got in to like the larger board, because usually what happens is the board sort of follow strong personalities. So if you have someone that has a really strong personality, in particular, is perhaps skeptical of this, you want to make sure you've identified it before you get in and start, heavily having these conversations. Otherwise, sort of the work will be undone a bit by people with these strong, personalities. So it's really time well spent trying to figure out both your champion and then who is the person that may have the most questions.
Debbie, that's a great point. I was actually made a note to kind of circle back to this, but you beat me to it. And I think that board members, particularly from the financial sector that step in, do have a certain point of view around impact investing. But there's also the kind of the old school board member, right? They may not be in the financial sector, but I think that there's in some organizations that I've had conversations with, there's the typical orientation of a board member and their view of fiduciary duty as has been explained to them early on. So in some cases, some board members feel like their duty is to maximize revenue for the foundation, and that's end of story. So I think being able to go through all of the fiduciary duties and have a conversation around, there is equal weight between maximizing revenue and also supporting mission. And you can argue that under impact investing, if done well, you can still do both, but being able to identify those issues, as Debbie said, and have that conversation with that board member, whether they've come from the financial sector or they've just been oriented in such a way, because a lot of folks will serve on multiple boards and they bring that same perspective to multiple boards, but having those conversations and trying to overcome these challenges on the beginning, or at least build a case so that you could swing as many folks to that side as you want, if it's appropriate. I would say this too, I've seen very few organizations where you're going to get complete consensus, right? It's the chances that you're going to get everybody on board is probably small, but again, you're starting to work towards how do I get as many as possible, and then how do I make those who may have concerns, how do I make them comfortable? And then again, that kind of builds up what we're about ready to get into, which is kind of the learning journey. Debbie, you're on mute.
Took off my headphones. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to bring up, because Chris kind of hit on that, prudent investor standards. I think we've not seen that as much, but certainly early on, that was a big topic where it could be your investment manager, but most often it could be someone on the board as well, where they're held to prudent investor standards, where they feel that they have to maximize income. And so the only impact investments that they really wanted to even consider were ones where there was no give up of the return. So they were looking for things that did both, had an impact and had a return. And that doesn't usually fit with most foundations that have place-based strategies or looking to solve more complex problems. So there is information. I think it's on Mission Investor Exchange, but you can also just go to the IRS and pull down information around program-related investments and mission investments. And they say very specifically that it is okay if you can make investments and still align with prudent investment standards and not maximize your financial return as long as the investments match your mission. And that is why mission is so important. And kind of back to the first part of this, like we've had some foundations that have really general missions, alleviating poverty or some such thing like that, which makes it really easy. And then there's people like Chris that have really narrow missions, which make it much more difficult. And so we had to do work on that, right, Chris? Like we had to do work on the mission of his foundation and make sure that comported, with the public or with the prudent investor standards that they were held to. So it wasn't easy. It took us a while. We had to get some, outside advice and some trust advice and things like that. But that's another thing that you really want to think about. But that prudent investor standard is out there. It is real. It is something that that the board members need to think about. But as long as you're doing it in line with your mission, then you should be okay.
So how do you set about getting the board on board, right? So we've done all of our research. We've looked at all the websites. We've watched all the webinars, and we've started pulling together the information. Now it's time to start distributing and figuring out how are we going to get the conversation rolling. So I think establishing a learning agenda is always helpful on the front end. So instead of just kind of moving into this conversation ad hoc, being able to sit down as that person leading the charge to say, okay, this is the kind of the timeline I'd like to be able to put on this. Here are my opportunities where I'm going to have the board together. Do I need the full board? Do I need the investment committee? How do I want to kind of start to advance this conversation? So getting that kind of figured out and fleshed out is important, and then determining how much information and when you're going to be able to distribute is always kind of a good game plan to start with. But really the meat of this conversation is really going to be around building the time and how you use your time. We think it's I would always say err on the side of more than less time in this conversation, because you never know what you're going to run into. As Debbie was saying, of course, we ran into the standard trustee questions around impact investing, the hand wringing, a lot of the questions, can we do this, can we not? But there was, for us, there was an unanticipated layer of complexity simply because Northern Trust sits on our board as corporate co-trustee. And they also serve as investment advisor. So they were wearing two different hats and had to come to the conversation from two different perspectives in some ways. So having time to, or making sure that you're putting reasonable expectation for a timeline is super important, so that you're not stressed out and you're not causing a lot of anxiety for those that are trying to help you. So how do you use your time, and what do you focus on? So I think now that you have a bunch of information, you've had your values conversation, I think showing examples and starting to have conversations that drill down a little bit deeper about the opportunities that might be available to you or are available to you in your community, and how those align with your values and your mission is a great way to start. I know that we, part of our conversation had been instead of looking at this as impact investing over here and grants over here, we've done everything we can to kind of dissolve that silo and have conversations across program and across finance so that we're all on the same page, and hopefully at the end of the day, we're rowing in the same direction. And we would couch a lot of our impact investing as catalyzing and supercharging our grant making. So in our case, we have a defined universe of grantees. We have 318 grantees that basically are outlined in the will that we can support. Just they can pick up the phone and say, Chris, I'd like a grant. We're not as reactive as most foundations are. So one of the things that we ran into is affordable housing, for instance, huge challenge, huge need in each one of the communities that we serve, but we don't have anybody in that eligible pool that's working on affordable housing that's eligible to receive grants. Maybe there's kind of one. But all our other communities outside of Jacksonville, there's nobody that we can make grants to. So it was super important to be able to say, okay, well, now we have a strategy. We could possibly provide grants in the community around technical assistance, helping to build the capacity of CDCs and CDFIs and use our convening power there, but then use our impact investing to really catalyze what we're trying to do on the grant making side by going with bigger bets into the CDFI space for affordable housing or community facilities. So being able to make that argument that you can do both and in fact, it's a great continuum to be able to say, we're going to use our grant making to support our impact investing and vice versa is huge. When you're when you're able to pull the board together, and I've also seen this, especially with our board, sometimes staff can talk about impact investing all day long, and it doesn't really hit home until you can bring that expert in or another practitioner to allow trustees to ask a bunch of questions, learn from them. I don't think it ever hurts to have a third party present in a conversation to be able to be an objective advisor, to be able to provide feedback and experience. I think that's huge, and I've seen that pay dividends for these conversations. Using that time to talk about the different kinds of tools. So are you going to focus on program related investments? How does that look in your community? If you're trying to achieve X, is it more effective to use a program related investment or maybe a guarantee? So those are the sort of conversations you can start prompting in these at these meetings. And then Debbie, I kind of like to toss this over to you to talk about the risk side, because that is a huge area where trustees just dig into. They're worried about the reality of what happens to the endowment by moving into this. How do we dot our I's and cross our T's best as we can through diligence and the like? So would you talk a little bit about some of the risk and how to address it?
Yeah, so I do think when you're trying to get your board on board, it's always good to crawl before you walk and to walk before you run. So when you're talking about sort of the types of investments, because they're going to want to sort of know that as part of this learning journey, you really want to make sure that you're talking about the risk of the investments. We always talk to our clients specifically about working through intermediaries as the first step. So that's primarily investing in CDFIs, and that's why you see a lot of foundations start there. A lot of investors start investing through CDFIs because we have data that we can pull down that shows that the loss rate in CDFI portfolios since the start of CDFI investing, we started in 1995. There may have been people that started slightly before that, but the loss ratio has been close to zero. So very limited loss in the CDFIs. And so that can go a long way towards giving boards more comfort. Where they're not going to be comfortable is if you start out with, we're going to do a venture capital fund or a private equity fund. Most boards or finance committees sort of understand the risk proposition of things like that. So they're not going to be as willing to sort of go that direction. And then the other is you kind of want to stay away from project-based investments. It's very different than, like I know Path is doing some investments in real estate and things like that, intentional. but those are related to their business. And I hope we can get into that and have Kristen share sort of what they're doing on their side. But if you're doing it as an impact investment, you're doing it as a way to invest your capital. Taking direct project risk is a very first start. It's probably not the easiest thing to do to get your board on board. What we're trying to do, the intent here from a risk perspective, is to really minimize that risk, especially on the first slice of projects or programs that you're going to be undertaking by working through intermediaries, because then that takes a lot of questions off the table. The last thing we want to do is go into an investment and then lose any of the money. Because then if anyone's never done that before, they're going to shut you down and they're not going to let you advance the conversation, which is what we don't want to have happen. So we always suggest really looking at CDFIs or other intermediaries that can limit your risk. We always get tons of questions around, well, we don't have any CDFIs. We can talk about that too, about strategies and what other people have done around helping loan funds that are in existence become CDFIs or attracting CDFIs. Chris has we could talk for probably a whole nother session on his CDFI friendly work in the state in Jacksonville that he's put together. So there are ways to get around that, but I am just talking for me and for Chris too, that working through intermediaries is your first step. It really goes a long way with getting your board on board.
The other, another point is, that will probably get brought up with your board and trustees in this conversation is staffing and capacity to be able to do the diligence and understand the risk. So for us, we have an outsourced CIO, and our advisor provides, the recommendations for our investments, and our corporate co-trustee manages kind of our back office. So we don't have a CFO, we don't have a CIO on staff personally, right? So we don't really, we have several program officers, but we don't have anybody on staff that has that trained financial expertise that some foundations may have. So to help kind of help the board in this conversation and get them comfortable, in our investment policy, we made sure that every PRI that comes before the board goes through due diligence through an objective third party. So sometimes, Northern Trust is kind enough, we may go into deals together and they may share their diligence with us. So I think that's an example for y'all to consider. There could be opportunities for your advisor to either share if they could be a co-investor or maybe conduct some of the due diligence, but more likely you'll probably have to hire somebody if you don't have that expertise on staff. So there are third parties out there and consultants that you could bring in to do the due diligence. And again, trying to get, as you're kind of navigating this path with the trustees, understanding what is it that they would like to see in a diligence report is huge, so that you can kind of share that with your consultant and make sure you're giving the trustees what they need. One example of how important that is our board doesn't consist of a bunch of financial folks. We have subject matter experts around our mission, but we're not super heavy on the finance side. So when we were doing diligence, they were giving us all sorts of ratios in this report that it didn't matter if it's 3-to-1 or 2-to-6 or whatever it was, it didn't mean anything to the trustees. So we had to go through and say, okay, how do we make this understandable to them? I mean, literally we went through and said, okay, I need acceptable ranges. So let's do a color code. Let's do green, yellow, and red on some of these things, so that the folks that know higher ed and continuing education, but not finance, understands, okay, this range for the CDFI is acceptable or not acceptable. So another kind of part of the conversation that you may zero in on to help bring, to get you to the conclusion that you want, is to really focus on the diligence piece and helping support the board in those decisions. Moving on, trying to move on here. There we go. It may jump 6 slides ahead because I hit it 6 times. So hopefully you've had the conversations, you've done your, gone through your learning agenda. The trustees or the board are comfortable with moving forward, at least trying to get a better understanding of what it is, right? The there. So this is when you kind of go back with your team or with some, maybe a committee of the board as well, and you start to begin some program design. But some of the things that I think that you're going to want to understand early on is, what does staffing look like? Are you going to bring staff on to this role? You're going to recommend that you increase staff? Are you going to dedicate existing staff to this? What are their capacities? What are their needs? Something that was really important for us in having this conversation is, what I've learned down the line is, once you say you're impact investing, then everybody crawls out of the woodwork and wants to give you a deal, right? So we're getting hit every day with deals, whether we know these people or not. My inbox is just flooded with all these sort of, equity deals and, outside the US and in the US. So having an understanding of what is it that you want to see happen in the world, what is your change you want to see, and understanding your themes and locking those down on the front end. And we do a lot of if then, and we believe in our theory of change, so whether it's, zeroing down themes for affordable housing or, an equitable and inclusive economy, whatever those are, it's helpful to put those together on the front end, because it helps you establish buoys, right, on the side. So if an investment comes across my desk, I can easily say, this is a no, or this is a possible, right? And that really is helpful, because before you know it, you're going to start getting inundated with requests. And then if you don't know when to say no, you're going to get kind of hamstrung for a bit. Also, as you're starting to think about your program design on the front end, bring your advisor in, have a conversation. Again, there may be some great resources that they can bring to the table. They may have expertise in certain tools. They may not have expertise in certain areas. And that's something that you need to have a conversation with them about. How do they build that expertise? Or where do you find that expertise elsewhere? This is the point where you're going to start really digging down into the tools, right? So if affordable housing is your bag, then, maybe start with program-related investments. Start really digging into that and what opportunities might be available to you. This is where you also want to start possibly getting some opinions. In our case, we had to get an opinion on impact investing. So a formal opinion was executed, so we can always, refer to that. And then we had draft template legal documents drawn up. So whether they're loan agreements or promissory notes, having that legal work done in advance to where you have templates to work off of is huge, especially if you're conducting this work in-house and you're not outsourcing it. And then trying to get your head wrapped around what happens once you make the investment and the money's in the community and you're wanting to kind of show some kind of impact or demonstrate impact. So understanding on the front end, what are your processes? How are you going to standardize the information? So really kind of zeroing in on monitoring, measurement, and evaluation. I know as one of our experiences early on is I thought I had a good plan with CDFIs. I mean, they report to the CDFI fund. They're used to reporting. I'll just get standardized reporting from them. And literally I would send out, I'd get 4 reports from 4 CDFIs and they would all be different, even if you gave them a little bit of guidance. So we really had to get very granular and specific about what we wanted them to measure and report on. So that took a little bit of time and learning there. But if you spend more time on the front end, figuring out what it is you want to be able to relate to your trustees around impact and what kind of changes are being made as a result of these impact investments, it always helps get you there faster if you put a little bit of time on the front end. And then this is something that Debbie really helped us with. There's a lot of creative accounting, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean that negatively by any means. But for instance, we were carrying our program-related investments off our balance sheet and just basically documenting them as cash for a long time. So understanding where you think these investments are going to go and how you're going to account for them. And this is where your conversation with the advisor is going to be super important because, and I won't steal your thunder, Debbie, because I'd love for you to talk a little bit about some of the, some of the ideas you gave us, but totally changed the way that we started looking at where our investments sit, and then really started thinking about how do we reorganize our asset classes so that we can, the impact investing fits kind of hand in glove with the different asset classes and how we might increase PRIs over here and reduce fixed income over there and the like. So Debbie, would you take just a little bit and kind of maybe dig into the accounting side and how, some of the ideas that you have around where you book these things?
Yeah. So a lot of times, so program-related investments are for people that have a 5% spend. So if you're a community foundation, you don't have a 5% spend. And some other charitable groups don't have that either, but they still use that terminology. So I'm going to use it sort of across the board. And so how we usually look at the two things is like whether or not it's a mission-related or a program-related investment. When we worked with Chris, it was really based upon risk. So if it's a lower risk investment, then that we felt we could make the case that it's more bond-like. So those would be like CDFI investments. Then those would go on the balance sheet held as other assets and actually part of the investment portfolio. So we typically do, and we didn't do this with Chris's foundation, but with other foundations, we actually have an IPS statement around impact. Well, I guess you do, Chris, have an IPS, don't you? Yes, you have it. You do. Yeah, you do. Sorry. So we create a separate impact policy statement that sits under the IPS. So, your IPS lays out all the different kinds of investing that you do. And so under that, we have this impact statement where the board would say, we want a certain percentage and a certain dollar amount often. So it's like, we'll do this certain percentage up to this dollar amount of impact investments, and then further define sort of what that means, what types of investments. That's where it could say, only through intermediaries, and then could say, the maximum term is X. It could even say rate or, hurdles, those types of things. And then it can also say the process. So it can say like who has approval. Is it the investment committee first and then the board, or is it just the board or just the investment committee? Do you have a separate impact committee? So you can lay all that out. And the reason that you really want to do that is twofold. Well, one is because obviously it makes your life a lot easier, but if you have board turnover, you don't want to have to start again, right? You don't want to have to go through this again every time you get a new board person in to try to convince them this is what they should be doing. You have this process and it's all documented and they should be able to see that. So that's super helpful. So what we did, like with Chris specifically, was really look at of what they had invested in their PRA bucket. A lot of them actually were more bond-like. So they were low-risk CDFI investments that had 5-year investment horizons, paying probably 2% interest. So much more bond-like. So if you can move those out of your PRI bucket and move them into the balance sheet bucket that you have, then for the PRI bucket, you can do things that are higher risk. So this is where, for instance, Chris's foundation wanted to make an investment in a higher risk social enterprise business that they really wanted to see and hope that their model would work. But from an underwriting standpoint, we couldn't get comfortable, and neither could the outside party that he brought in to evaluate it, that this was a risk that we could really say with any certainty that we were going to get the money back, that they were going to get the money back. So then what they were able to do was put that into their program-related investment bucket, and then they set that expectation with their board. Because again, where I started before, you never want to be in a situation where your board's surprised if you lose money or something doesn't work out. So if you put it into the program-related investment side, which is an equivalent of a grant, which you don't get back. So we sort of set it up like, we're going to do this as if it was a grant. If we get it back, that's great. However, the learnings and everything that we're going to get from this are going to offset any potential risks that we have. So, it really does then allow Chris and his foundation and others that I work with to do things that are higher risk, but they're doing them for a very specific reason, from the learning that comes from the support that it's giving to the groups that they work with, and extent, going past grant making a bit, whatever, without actually sort of undermining the work that you've done with your board on the actual impact investment side if you are putting it on your balance sheet as in the investment portfolio.
Yep. And then again, and just lastly, Debbie referenced it, revising your investment policy statement to reflect the work that you're going to be doing around impact. And again, these would all be tools and pieces of the overall presentation or conversations that you're going to have that you would socialize with the board. This is where they kind of react to it, that crystallizes what could be for the board. And then they're able to actually react to things and provide, hopefully provide some of their expertise to help refine some of the work that you're doing, whether it's the tools or putting you in touch with consultants or legal work, or even just becoming more and more comfortable with the process. So having that final investment policy statement approved and agreed kind of puts you on the path. And I think with that, we may be done. I think we're ready for questions, and I think we definitely have some time. I know a lot of folks on the call they're already in the space, right? So would love to hear from y'all about some of your experiences. Love to answer any questions if we can.